Hey, everybody, this is Tom Sega from Duluth Pack, and this is the Duluth Pack podcast, Leader of the Pack. And our special guest today is a guy I met about 30 years ago, and he is a young entrepreneur at the time. And he has a great story of multiple businesses. And talk about an entrepreneur. This is a guy who buys one business, starts another business, and has been very, very active in his community. Our special guest today is Mike Prom, President and CEO, owner of Voyageurs Canoe Outfitters and Voyageur Brewing Company. Mike, welcome.
Well, thanks, Tom. I appreciate it. I don't think I'm that old. I think you got the years wrong, but we'll go with that.
Well, it's got to be darn close, and you're a
No,
lot younger than me.
It is. I think it's exactly 30 years since we met. I'm just teasing.
Holy cow, this time has flown, and you live in such a beautiful place. It's one of those places that people would dream to go to, and you can tell us all about that because you've been able to make a career out of living in one of the most beautiful places on the planet Earth. But before we get to all that, Mike, let's go back a little bit. And where did you grow up, and where did you go to school? And then we'll kind of come into is how did you get in the outfitting business?
Oh, great. Well, I'm from St. Cloud, Minnesota. That's where I was born and raised. My mom and dad are both from farm. Farm. My grandparents both had farms, and they actually grew up 5 miles apart and met each other horseback riding, if you can believe that. And so we ended up having a home that was within 10 miles of both grandparents and all my cousins and so on. So yeah, I went to St. Cloud Tech, which is a public school there. Went to St. John's University for 2 years, played some football. I realized that maybe I wasn't as good as I thought I was, and I also kind of changed degrees. So in my junior year, I switched over to St. Cloud State and got a degree from St. Cloud State in recreation. So that was where I was there. I did an internship at Gull Lake in near Brainerd, near Nisswa, for Quarter Deck Resort. Well, it's kind of the last thing I did was for my degree. My wife and I had just gotten married, and that was the last credits I needed for school. And we both realized that we loved the resort business, but wanted to be farther north. We both had experiences, in Canada, in the Boundary Waters, paddling. I was on Lake of the Woods for a couple summers doing stuff. And I thought that Gull Lake and Brainerd was pretty cool, but I wanted to be farther north. And so we just, being ignorant, really dumb, ignorant, whatever you want to say, we started looking at the newspaper for resorts that were for sale. And I found an ad for a business that was for sale in Ely, and it was a canoe outfitting business. And I had never, we always were self-outfitted. My dad, we'd always go, we went to camps, we had our own stuff. And this was kind of foreign to me, an outfitter. I didn't even know what it was. And you could make a living doing this, because when I got into college, I was going to be a teacher and run a camp. That was my goal. And then once I got in the classroom, I was in elementary education. I'm like, I don't know if I can do this. I mean, I love kids, but to do this every day, I'm not sure. So I switched to a recreation degree. And so I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I knew that I loved the outdoor recreation and that educational component and the thing that it does for people. And so I didn't know what I was going to do. And we went and toured a couple of outfitting businesses in Ely and said, this is exactly what we want to do. And we just about bought one in Ely. It's just funny how things work out. And it kind of fell through in the end. We had a good attorney, and I was mad at him when the deal fell through. And then he was my customer for years, and I thanked him every time. And that's another whole story. I listened to my attorney, even though it didn't feel right at the time. And it had to do with the non-compete. And this guy was actually back in business in a couple of years. So it was really good advice. But it was like we were sold. I was moving to Ely. I was going to have an outfitting business. And then 5 months later, we didn't have a deal. So I went, this is how old I am. I went to the library and got back issues of the Star Tribune, because on Sundays, they had a businesses for sale section in the Star and Tribune. This is before internet, right? And so started looking back, and I found an ad that said resort of a lifetime at the end of the Gunflint Trail. And called, the phone number was to a realtor, called. This was about April 1st to go look at it, and May 1st Sue and I were moving up there with a purchase agreement, and we closed in June. And never had been in the Gunflint Trail in my life.
So your attorney liked that deal a lot better than the other one.
Well, he thought we were pretty crazy there too, but it didn't have the same flag. So, the business that we were going to buy in Ely cash flowed, and it was a beautiful business. The one that I bought at the end of the Gunflint Trail was all potential. So I think my accountant is the one at the end of the trail said, "You guys are nuts." And we got a loan from my mom and dad for the down payment. We were right out of college. We were 22 years old. And so we got a loan from my mom and dad for the down payment and bought it on a contract for deed from Don Enzenauer, who we may talk about. And he sold it to us. He turned down a cash offer from a couple of attorneys from Chicago because they made the mistake of telling him everything they were going to change about the place. And we happened to come up the weekend after and looked at it and loved it. And he sold it to us on a contract for deed with very little money down, that we had to borrow from our folks because we just got out of school. We didn't have any money. I had $5,000 to my name, And so we did that, and we moved up there, and it was a blessing. It's the greatest thing. I mean, it's just sometimes you got to be lucky, right? And we were lucky. The location is awesome, and maybe I'm getting ahead of it there a little bit, but that's kind of how we went from growing up in St. Cloud to ending up at the end of the Gunflint Trail.
So can you explain where the end of the Gunflint Trail is for our listeners that aren't quite aware of it?
Sure. Well, it is right on the U.S.-Canadian border. It's on a lake called Saginaw Lake. And Grand Marais is the closest town, which is 60 miles. So you drive up Interstate 35 to Duluth. In Duluth, you get on Highway 61, which is the scenic North Shore Drive, which is just beautiful from Duluth to Grand Marais. And then you turn northwest for 60 miles on Highway 12, which is called the Gunflint Trail. It's a scenic byway.
Mike, all of the trips that you've done up and down the Gunflint Trail, and I know that area very well, if you had to guess, how many moose have you seen along the Gunflint Trail over 30 years?
Well, it's definitely in the hundreds for sure. Our record was 19 in one trip back in the 90s. So in the winter, the moose will come out on the trail. I think partly because it's easier walking. It's always funny when you start talking wilderness and disturbing the wilderness and everything. And, between the wolves and the moose, they're not dumb. They get on a road or a trail or whatever. But they lay down on the road to lick, in those days, the salt, right, that was on the curves and so on. And so, and what's kind of funny about a moose, maybe not funny, but is their eyes don't glow like a deer. They're much, much more difficult to see. So you're driving and you come around, and then all of a sudden you have this 1,800-pound beast laying in the road trying to get up, and it's like a cartoon with their feet just slipping all over to get out of the way. So a better question is, how many moose have I hit in 30 years? And I can honestly say one, and it was a calf. It was a cow and a calf. It was a year-old calf. And I slid over with my minivan. I had the soccer mom van at the time because we were running to sport shows and stuff. And I just about missed it, but just caught the calf's back on my side mirror. And the mirror went flying. I had 2 wires sticking out of the side of the van. Didn't even knock the moose over. I mean, I didn't hurt it. And that's the only moose versus vehicle incident that I've had.
For all the trips you've made, we better knock on some wood somewhere for you that's the only close call that you've had. So for people who would like to see a moose, you need to talk to Mike after this and call Voyageur Canoe Outfitters, because your opportunity to see a moose in the United States of America is probably better heading up to your resort than anywhere else in this country. And that's my opinion from being on the Gunflint Trail
I
many times.
I think you're right in the lower 48. I know there's some parts of Maine that might disagree, but we are, and it's changed immensely since the 90s. The moose population's down a little bit. We're seeing a nice comeback, and we're seeing really good, healthy moose again. So hopefully that'll swing back to, 17 or 19 in one trip in the winter is probably crazy, right? But we're seeing 2 or 3 sometimes now on trips, so it's great to see them.
That's awesome. So Mike, let's talk about, you're 22 years old. you work a deal with Don Enzenauer, who I got to know many, many years ago when they were running Voyageurs. They sell it to you. You walk in bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and a lot of energy. Tell us what those first couple of years were like.
Well, huge learning curve. I mean, one is you're 22 years old, so you really know nothing. You think you know everything and you know nothing. Two is Don Enzenauer had a fifth grade education. He was a farmer from Owatonna, so he was a very practical man. I mean, I respect him immensely because for the education that he had, and for him to move from Owatonna, Minnesota to the end of the Gunflint Trail to start a business from scratch makes my risk and my bravery look like nothing, right? And so he moves up there and he starts it from scratch and starts a little fishing camp. Really, he had 8 RV sites, a couple trailers that he rented. He was more of a boat and motor place, but he realized that when the Boundary Waters happened, that he had to get into some of these people are renting canoes. And so he had a handful of canoes, and we bought it, and we learned a lot from him in that first year, to be completely honest. And there was a neighbor named Earl and Anita Cipher that owned Superior North Canoe Outfitters, and they took us under their wing, and they were on about their fourth or fifth business. They had a campground in Lake of the Woods and so on, and I learned an immense amount of the business from them. Drinking cocktails on the deck, going down to Trail Center for a burger, whatever, because they have the same pains that you do, right? You're dealing with customers, you're dealing with staff, you're dealing. I mean, we're trying to work with the government to be able to rent trips and all of that, and those are all challenges that we had in common, and they were like the same age as my folks, so it was almost a kid mom and dad relationship, and so learned a ton. And they weren't seasoned outdoors people; they were great business people, but it didn't take us long, and he's calling me asking me about lakes and fishing spots and gear, because Sue and I love to get out, and we learned really early on that we need to get in a canoe and paddle, and we made these huge trips that we'd go out for one night, or we'd get dropped off. Granite River is a 3-day trip. 6 a.m. we started, and then we're paddling in at 5 or 6 or 7 at night, or going into Sag and going through Seagull, Red Rock. We're making loops because we only have a day, because we're trying to run a business. But the first 3, 4, 5 years, we just needed to get into every lake that we told people about so that we knew about it.
So, Mike, what type of services did you start with those first couple of years? And then how did that grow for you specifically as the Boundary Waters? And you're also on the edge of the Quetico,
Sure.
and you have areas where people can use motors in a limited area and limited motors, and then canoe only types of things.
Yeah, well, the services that we had the first year, we had about 12 boats and motors that we rented. We had 8 campsites. We had 3 rental trailers, and then we had enough canoeing equipment to put out probably 20 or 25 people at one time. So very small, very small. We put out one of the services that we do. We call it complete outfitting, which is kind of like your all-inclusive. So you come up with nothing, and we provide everything from food to sleeping bags to tents, to get you so you can go out on a trip with basically just the clothes in your duffel bag, and you put them in a pack and away you go. We did 12 of those the first year that we were in business, and now we do 12 of those on a Saturday. So I mean, just to give you, I mean, that's how much it's changed. But it was the opportunity that we had. And what we didn't realize is, you talk about the Quetico Park and the Boundary Waters Canoe area, and then there's another area just called plain old Canada, or Crown Land, or Queensland. And so we had 3 areas that we could send people, all with a different set of rules, different group sizes, different fee schedule, meaning how much you would have to spend. So what a toolbox when a customer calls you, whether they're planning a year in advance and they're bringing 75 people, like a school we used to do, Pius High School in Milwaukee would bring busloads. Well, we sent them into the Crown Land because they had 20 in a camp, and they were bigger groups, and they had a different thing that didn't work to go into the Boundary Waters. Or somebody that called us the first week of August and wants to go out tomorrow. Well, it's a little limited. Permits are gone, right? So we had those options. So when I talked earlier on about just being super lucky, of the location we got. The location was huge for us, is huge for us.
So it opened up three revenue sources for you. One would be the Boundary Waters and outfitting there. One would be the Quetico and outfitting there with multiple tiers within each. And then there was just the Crown Land itself, where
Yeah,
people would not be in the Boundary Waters or the Quetico, but they would just be in the Canadian waters.
exactly. You got it.
And how did you then plan the growth of the business, saying, okay, I have three buckets in the summer, and then we'll talk about how you started getting into some winter business as well,
Sure.
because that your business, 30 years ago or 25 years ago, it was kind of like, hey, we're a summer business, and most people shut down and just scuttled the business for the winter. Heck, you lived there. And so pretty cool. But what did you do and how did you plan for that growth for your business with those three buckets of revenue sources?
Sure. Well, there's a couple things there. One is, being a 23, 24, 25-year-old male that did play sports, and I'm super competitive. So I wanted to win. Don't ask me how, what I define winning today and winning then were probably very different. But I was super driven that I wanted to be the biggest, best outfitter, whatever that looked like. So that was part of it. But the second thing is as I said early on, we bought a business that didn't cash flow. So when we negotiated our deal with Don Enzenauer, we had the first 2 years were interest only payments. And then the next 3 years were discounted payments, like amortized over a whole long period of time. And so we had 5 years to grow this business into a business that could support what we bought. So there was a little bit, I think fear maybe is a good way to explain how you build it, is we needed to get it done or we weren't going to be able to make our payments. And then the place we bought was pretty rustic. I was going to say crude, but I'll say rustic. It was pretty rustic in that we didn't have running water in the winter. In those days, you didn't have to upgrade your septic system when you purchased a commercial building. We knew that if we we're going to get another building permit to build some of the things we did, we were going to have to put money into a very expensive septic system and some of those things. So what you do is, my dad always said, if it doesn't work on paper, it doesn't work. And so you start trying to make it work on paper. And you're saying, if we're going to build a lodge and we're going to build a septic system, and we're going to make our payments in 5 years because we know what those are going to look like, we backed into it. This is the size of business that we need. Okay, how are we going to get there? So now you start, eating the elephant one bite at a time and figuring out what are our revenue sources, what's the low hanging fruit that we can expand right away. And that was for us, it was outfitting. Cabins are tough. You got a huge investment. You build a cabin, it takes, years to pay for it. It's expensive. So outfitting was a really good way for us to kind of expand that balloon quickly, because each year we could put money in more equipment and we could get our customers to come back, but then get new ones and then get them to come back and get new ones. And so we literally over doubled our business every year we were in business the first 10 years. And that is easier to do when you start from virtually nothing, but still boom, double, boom, double, boom, double, boom, double. And there's all kinds of issues and problems that go with it. But it was awesome. It was fun.
That's great. And I remember those days when you were working as hard in the winter as you were in the summer, even though there wasn't a lot of customers there, because you're planning for the next season and you're building and you're fixing and you're the boat motors and the boats and the canoes and everything else that went into your business. It's amazing that all the things
And
that
there was no internet, so 10 sports shows. So we'd hire somebody to do that. So November, December, you're doing all those things. You've got it. That's the list. Then all of a sudden, January, boom, St. Paul Sports Show. Then the next show, the next show. We go January to Easter without coming home sometimes, going from one sports show to the other, because that's how you taught people about you. That's how you promoted. You had your brochures, and the brochures you put the little letter of the show you're at in the lower corner because you're trying to track where they came from, because you're spending tons of time and money, right? You're at a hotel and the shows were expensive and you're on the road and you're going, then at the end of the next year, are we going back to Chicago? Are we going back to Milwaukee? Are we going to Des Moines? All of those things. So we had a whole circuit of shows we did all through the 90s.
Mike, at this point now, with the internet and technology and all that, do you do any trade shows anymore?
We don't. My daughter is graduating from college this year, and the last show we did was the year she was in kindergarten. And we did Milwaukee, was always a really good show for us. What happened with sports shows when the internet came is sports shows turned out to be some people's vacation, and we were there to book their vacation. So if their vacation was to go there and drink a beer and buy a mop and watch the knife, the knife display or whatever, and buy some, some sugar coated almonds or whatever, if that was that, it really just changed the people that were walking around. In the 90s, you know, 6 guys would walk around with cash in their hand and they're booking their vacation and they're going to go talk to 4 businesses. And our goal always was to have enough deposit cash in hand to pay for the show that we were just at. So the down payment, the hotel, the food. And we felt if we took that amount of deposits, that amount of cash, and that was then we knew we had a good show. And we did that most of the time, but you start figuring out which ones are the better ones and not as good. Then in 1994, we had a customer that said, "You guys should have a website." I said, "What the heck are you talking about? I don't even know what a website is." And he showed us on the computer, and I remember looking at, so this is crazy. But he did it for free because he just was convinced we needed it. So we were one of the first businesses up there to have a website. And that was probably 94, 95, something like that. And then by 2005, we were done with sports shows because we said we can do better staying home and answering phone and now email, right? And those kinds of things, than living out of a suitcase in a motel.
Mike, what has been your most gratifying part of what you do for a living as an outfitter?
Well, so I thought we were going to go as a business owner, so I'll answer 2 questions there. I would say as an outfitter, it's introducing somebody. This is going to sound cliche, but it's sincere. It's introducing somebody to the woods that has an experience that changes their life, and it's different than saying that they loved it and they're going to come back. Because I'm thinking of 2 or 3 groups or people in specific that were in groups that I'm not sure they ever came back or were going to come back, but it changed their life because they were so far the Illinois. We used to sponsor a group out of Illinois that was a halfway house for they were like troubled teen. It was a men's house. They were like 17, 18, and I just remember them getting out of the car, and I've never seen so many trees. The one guy said that was his comment when he got out of the car, and they came back and they would survive, and a super cool leader. And they would come out and I'd say, "How was that?" "That was awful. That's the worst thing I ever did." And then you get them pizza and you're talking and you just watch the room and they're so proud and so excited. And will they ever come back again? I don't know. Did it change their life? Absolutely. No question. Are they better people for doing it? There's no question in my mind. So I think that's probably the most gratifying. And it kind of goes along with one of my mentors, a camp director I had. I remember one of the first groups I took out, and I came back. I was young, 19 years old or something, and I was whining because of the rain and the wind, and I don't, and trying to get some sympathy from him. And he said, "Did you get some sun?" Yeah. Monday was sunny. Oh yeah, Tuesday, it was white caps. It was awful. Yeah, and then Thursday it rained and whatever. He goes, "Wow, awesome." And I'm like, "What?" He said, "Awesome. You got all 4. You got everything. That was perfect. You couldn't sketch it better. Disney couldn't have made a better trip for you." It was all of those things, and it really made me think about it every time it rained or it was windy. And and you've got people, really? So you're going to give somebody a Boundary Waters experience that's going to be sunny and dead calm for 7 days? That's not fair either. And
That's
so it kind of
boring.
that's boring, right? I'll take it. Don't get me wrong. But the point, I think the point is that it made me look at the wilderness different and going out on a trip different. And so I always took that as, let's make sure that somebody that uses our service thinks about that, right? I remember the first year we were in business, I rented a trailer to a guy, and halfway he had booked for a week. It was like a mobile. It was a cabin, but it was a trailer, like an RV trailer. And he'd driven for quite a while. He was from Missouri or Illinois or something. And he came out. He said, "I'm leaving. The fish aren't biting. It's wrong. It's whatever, the mayfly hatch or the weather or the moon or whatever his theory was, and there's no fish and I'm leaving." I'm like, "Okay." So I gave him half his money back. This is a lesson of hard knocks. because I don't, he's not happy. That's just who I am. I gave him half his money back. Next year he comes up, he limits out in 2 days. We're going home. We got all the fish. We don't have any more of our limit. And he wanted his money back. And I turned to Sue and I said, this isn't going to work. Right. He has a best trip, he leaves, and he has a crappy trip, he leaves. And so, the next year I said, here's the deal. And I said, and I can remember his name, but I won't say that. And I go, here's the deal. You're paying for the whole thing, whether you stay or not. Oh, no, 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 no. And I didn't take his reservation. He never came back. I booked it with somebody else. But the point of the story is if the only thing that's going to make or break that trip is catching a fish, right? I mean, we're all trying to catch a fish, or we're all trying to go hunting and get the game and all of those kinds of things. But if that is the sole purpose and the way that you're going to say the experience was great or not great, I think we're using the wrong measuring stick.
I couldn't agree with you more, because it's funny. You hear all the stories. Everybody comes in and they want to tell you the stories, and usually I call them war stories. But some of the most miserable times you've ever had, because
Yep.
hey, we were up in the boundary waters and it snowed 6 inches one night. The next day it was dripping on us like crazy because it got up to 60 degrees. Then the mosquitoes hatch and we get bit by mosquitoes. On the way in, the wind was really bad and we got soaked on really cold water. And then 2 years later, you're like telling stories to your friends and you're like, it was the greatest trip ever.
Absolutely. We can't even remember the trip. There was 7 perfect days in a row. I
And
mean,
every
I
time you went
maybe
out,
can, but we don't talk about them, right? I mean, it just isn't. No, absolutely, and that's part of why we do that kind of trip, right? I call it calculated risk. I think that there's not enough of that uh, in our society today. And I try to take trips. I take a big snowmobiling trip in Canada where we go on logging roads and stuff, and you get stuck or whatever. And right, you don't want to be dumb. You don't want to be dumb, so that you. But on the other hand, if everything is safe and done for you, I'm not sure that's what we're built for either. So the idea of having a little inherent risk in an activity, I think, is healthy.
Mike, before we move on to Voyager Brewing Company, and for our listeners, we're talking to Mike Prom, the owner of Voyageurs Canoe Outfitters and Voyager Brewing Company. We'll get to that in a moment, but give us your handle specifically for Voyager Canoe Outfitters so people listening can go to your website, look up what services you have. And folks, I can tell you this guy comes highly, highly, highly recommended. He will make sure you have the best possible trip. He is not a weatherman. He's not Mother Nature. He can't predict the weather, but he can make you have a great time and go home with the stories that you really need to. So can you give us all of your handles?
Sure, absolutely. Voyager Canoe Outfitters.com. So just Voyager Canoe Outfitters.com. And I believe Voyager Canoe Outfitter and Outfitters, both singular and plural, will work. And obviously if you Google that as well. So, and that's been the name since the Ends and Hours started, or Don Ends and Hours started in 1961. Yeah, Facebook, find us on Twitter and Instagram. So yeah.
Absolutely. So Mike, what is one of the most harrowing stories that you've had living at the end of the Gunflint, which most people would consider living in the bush? I mean, you have electricity up there now, but I know the first couple of years you didn't have indoor plumbing and you heated with wood and all that. But what are some of the greatest stories that if somebody says, tell me one of the greatest ones, what comes to mind from you or your customers?
Wow, yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple that come to mind. I think, I was on the Gunflint Trail Fire Department for 20 years, ended my career there as the chief for 5 years, and so part of lots, right? Part of lots of them, both, because really when you're on the fire department on the Gunflint Trail, you're mostly doing EMT or EMS kind of runs and or search and rescue kind of runs. I mean, I can count the structure fires, probably on one hand. I did more evacuations than I did structure fires as a firefighter for wildfire and so on. So, I can think of a bunch. But the one for me personally, I don't know, I wouldn't call it a hero, but the one that I was probably the not no question the most scared was during the Ham Lake fire, 2007. We were doing, started off as an evacuation of the end of the Gunflint Trail because of wildfire. And then it turned into what we call structure protection. So we were starting sprinkler systems and getting homes ready for hopefully to survive the fire that is inevitable to come through. So that's chucking wood piles out from underneath your deck and making sure the windows are closed and those kinds of things. Because in a wildfire, you get ready, you get out of the way, the fire goes through, and then you go back and you save what's ever left. That's kind of, I mean, that's crude, but that's kind of what it's like in wildfire. And so me and my neighbor were the last two kind of leaving the end of the trail. The fire was crossing the Gunflint Trail near Sega Outfitters, which is about 2 or 3 miles from the end of the trail. And I was in my car by myself following him. And the fire was so hot, I had to lay down in the middle of the seat and drive down the middle of the Gunflint to get through that hot spot of fire because there was fire on both sides. And I felt like I literally couldn't sit up because it was so hot. And I can't believe to this day my tires didn't, melt. I mean, it's unbelievable what the temp must have to be, or the glass break. So that's probably, so being on the end of a dead end road causes issues when there's 1999 blowdown storm, several fires, Sag Quarter Fire of 1995, the 2007 Ham Lake Fire. So those are ones that are probably branded, if you will, in my brain the most. I don't know that I have. I mean, I got crap. I shouldn't have been out in a canoe and wind stories, but that's just, that's being dumb, right? And I've got a few of those, but I've never capsized in a canoe, which I can't believe. Now I said it out loud. I'm doomed this summer. And there's lots of times I should have, lots of times. And
how about rescue of people? Because Saginaw is one lake that a lot of people do get lost on, because you go, quite a few miles up the corridor, you hit the lake, and then all of a sudden you go, oh, shore's over there. And you go, oops, that's not shore. That's islands. And you get to that and you go, oh, that must be shore over there. And you go, oops, that's not shore. That's another set of islands. You go on and on and on doing this. A lot of rescue over the years.
Yeah, lots, but not as much as you'd think. I mean, you wouldn't believe how many times I help a group load their canoe and push them off and turn and look at Sue and go, I don't know, man. I don't know if this, they're going to come back, and it's kind of a joke. And with that said, people, if you've never been lost on a canoe trip, you're probably not being honest, right? I mean, we've all gone down a wrong bay, or we've tried to figure it out. There's people that are better at it than others. I'm really good at it, and it's because my map is out all the time, and I will not paddle somewhere if I don't believe I know exactly where I am on the map. And that takes a lot of work. It's just work. It's not hard. It's turning the map the direction you're going and saying that's got to be that, that's got to be that, and you just keep checking back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And when you get somewhere and it's not quite right, then you got to go, whoa, back up here. I mean, I've been lost in the fog. That's a whole different story. I almost spent the night out on Sag, bank banging my way back after night fishing, because the fog set in, you can't see anything. And I've gone out the next day and found people that spent the night, the night in the bottom of their boat sleeping because they couldn't get in. But from a loss standpoint, when you're on a canoe trip, you've got everything you kind of need, right? You've got a tent, you've got a sleeping bag. So even if you're lost, you can usually kind of survive, even though it's might be scary. It's definitely embarrassing. I had a couple that went out in October one year, and they were from overseas, so they didn't speak good English, and they were a couple days late, and we spent some time looking for them, and they just hunkered down in their tent on Sag and didn't move because they didn't know where they were until we went and looked for them. So there's some of those kinds of things. But really the most dangerous thing, there's three ways you die in the boundary waters, to be honest. One is you get hit by lightning. And so when there's a lightning storm, you need to be in a safe spot, and that's not tying your tarp to a tree. It's not, it's not laying on the roots in your tent. It's getting off the edge. It's not out on the end of your dock, right? I mean, but a little bit, if it's you're hit by lightning, you're hit by lightning, right? That's kind of, so that's one. Two is heart attacks, and so I think of it now, I'm 52 years old, and I'm still doing trips, and I drink lots of beer and eat really good food. So I'm out, we take really hard trips, and I'm always the most the most in search and rescue, the most, I guess, the most dead people I've carried out have been heart attacks, right? And it's that 50, 60-year-old man that doesn't know his limit and gets his heart rate up there. Yeah, and then probably has a sign and doesn't listen to it too. I mean, there's lots of that. And so I go out with my dad yet, who's in his 70s. I'm like, you feel, or if anything's different, let me know. We'll just sit down and we'll hunker down and we'll wait, right? Because we don't need to go there. And then the third thing is hypothermia. Um, Capsizing in cold water is the most deaths that I've seen and been part of. And that really doesn't matter. I mean, it does matter a little bit. Life jacket buys you a lot more time, but I've recovered people in life jackets too. So you just, if it's May on SAG, you need to be able to get out of the water in 6, 7, 8 minutes. You can't cut across something big and then capsize. You don't have time because the water's so cold. This year it might be June, it might be July.
That's the way it's going. In fact, I think tonight you're getting close to 8 inches of snow
Yeah,
up there.
it's snowing and raining right now as I sit here. So I guess my point is, I don't know what the start of that question is, but those are the things you need to do. I always say, wear your life jacket. Don't be stupid when you go across water, right? Because you need to be able to know how long it's going to take you to get out. So that's one. And then two, if there's if there's lightning, get out, and then just kind of know on your body. And if you don't do those things, you got everything in your boat you need to survive for a long, long time. It's actually pretty dang safe. It's safer than driving in Twin Cities.
Sure, for sure. In fact, Mike, you were talking about getting lost, and we started that with that. My first time years and years ago that I ever went up the lake in the daylight by myself, I got lost because it was the first time I'd ever been up there in the daylight. I'd been all over the lake in the daylight, but going
Different.
up and down the corridor into the Canadian side of the lake where I spent a lot of time, it was always going in on by boat or snowmobile at night. And then at the end of your trip, you're coming out at night. First time I went by myself in the daytime, I got completely twisted around, had to stop, pull out my maps, and figure out where the heck I was because I took a wrong turn somewhere.
And the other thing is, if you're
and
new at it and you go in the boundary waters and you go in the summer, you're not going to spend too much time, and you can find somebody to ask where you are on the map. And that's what I tell people. If you don't know where you are, and there's somebody that you can see, go paddle to them and just say, point to me. Almost every person I've ever helped on the lake that didn't know where they were, when I asked them to see their map, they had to pull it out of their pack. It wasn't sitting at, you know what I mean? Their map wasn't out and in front of them. And now GPS is a funny thing because people are so dependent on GPS, they don't know how to read a map. And so, if you have a battery, go out, all that, although it's helped a lot of people. I mean, right? I mean, I just got back from Costa Rica and I drove and I had my GPS, and you don't have to speak the language. You don't have to read a map. I mean, it's nice, right? But if those things, I remember the day when we didn't have all those things, it was much more challenging.
absolutely. And people need to just swallow their pride at times. So let's switch because you're an entrepreneur. I mean, you run this successful outfitting business. And I'm assuming the brewery came because you're a St. Cloud State grad, and we all know that St. Cloud State grads know how to drink some good beer. So let's talk about the inception of Voyageur Brewing Company and how that all came about and where you're going.
Absolutely. Well, I am a St. Cloud State grad, and I'm more of a whiskey guy in those days. But anyways, I got smarter and started drinking good beer. Um, when my kids got into so my kids are on the longest school bus route in the country. And when we talk about how many moose we saw, I figured out by the time they were in 7th or 8th grade, they had more miles on the Gunflint Trail than I did. Because they were going back and forth to school every single day, an hour and 15, hour and 20 minutes, leaving in the dark, coming back in the dark. So as they got into middle school, and they were both in athletics and extracurriculars, we bought a house in Grand Marais, so that we could, especially in the winter, or when they had things going on, it started out where we'd spend a night or two a week. And then by the time they're in high school, we were pretty much in town during the school year and up the trail in the summer. So being the entrepreneur that I am, and there was just an opportunity. I'm watching this explosion of breweries and enjoying it. When we would go on vacation, we were going to tap rooms and breweries because we thought it was super cool. It was a cool thing. And I had a partner that that I still have here. There's a couple of us involved right away, and now it's down to two. But it was really like a need for the town and an opportunity in a tourist town that did. I can't believe nobody's done this yet. That's where it started for me. And I love, as I said earlier, trying to figure out if it'll work. And so the best business plan I ever made was for the brewery. This is my seventh or eighth business, but this was by far the best business plan. I mean, I must have had, 75 sheets on my Excel spreadsheet with everything connected, and it was almost sick, just to the point where I'm having more fun with that than I am with the idea. But we put this thing together with no brewing experience, lots of business experience, some cash. We had a pretty good investment. We still needed to get it banked, and it exceeded our expectation. I mean, there's lots of learning things. We thought that the cans would be more profitable and the distribution would be more profitable. We wouldn't do as many, but the tap room was crazy, and it's been awesome. It's been really fun, and so that's kind of how we did it. It was really about we had laid out, if we're going to do this, we need the perfect location. And if we don't find the perfect location, we're not going to pull the trigger. So we looked for almost a year and a half for stuff that would work. And we wanted a view of the lake. We wanted to be visible from Highway 61, and we wanted to be in the downtown walking district of Grand Marais. So if the tourists were walking around, they could end up at our place, or if half of shopping and half want to have a beer, we could do that. So when this lot and this building kind of came for sale that we're in now, I told my partners, okay, either we're going to do it or we're not talking about it ever again, because it's the right spot.
The holy grail. Holy cow. I mean, your spot, if those are your three litmus tests for building that business. And I know Grand Marais, if for folks who want to go on a great road trip, go to Grand Marais, Minnesota, and stop at Voyageur Brewing Company, because it's really cool. The view is outrageous. You can park there, you can walk all over the town. It's absolutely crazy. But you have all this, so you find the place and you obviously buy the land and building, and now you're going to get going. And you said you had no brewing experience. So what are your steps to get to where you are now, because you have a successful business?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing we did is we hired a consulting company from the West Coast to come in and help us. One, make sure that it was possible to do here, because you got all these supply chain issues. You got to bring in hops, and you ship yeast, and you've got grain, and then you got a delivery and all of that. So we showed them the business plan. And then two is, I mean, I didn't know what a cold liquor tank was. I didn't know what a hot liquor tank was. I didn't know what anything was. My business partner had done some home brewing, had a little bit of brewing experience, so at least he could talk the lingo, but we just didn't know. I know you had Dave Hoops on. We talked to him. I went down and we toured. That's when he was at Fitker's there, and we walked through with him, and he gave us a lot of ideas. And even I think he mentioned that he's got a connection to most breweries in northern Minnesota. Well, after we got up and running, we hired him. This was when he was in between gigs, and we hired him as a consultant to come in, taste our beer, and help us out with some of our processes. So I think being older and being through business, I learned the outfitting business. I'm going to do it myself. I can do everything myself. And that is one way to learn it, right? I'm going to be the electrician. I'm going to be the guy that fixed the hot water heater, all of that. And I did that. When I get to this business, it's kind of the difference between knight and king, right? I was a knight, I want to fight, and the king, I want to be wise. I'm not either of those, but trying to figure out who can I have that knows this information, surrounding myself with good people. We hired a brewer with brewing experience. We have a different brewer now. But you can hire some of that stuff to be done. And the inverse is there's lots of breweries that are started by really good brewers that are horse crap business people. And that tends to be more the model in the US, is a lot of breweries where people that learn how to make beer, and they can make dynamite beer, but could they manage processes and their money and people, right? I mean, it's people business. I've had enough business experience. It's all about people. If you can't manage your customers, your vendors, and your employees, you have nothing. And if you're good at that, you could just about do anything. And if you're not good at that, you're going to just about fail at anything.
So what were your first steps? You secure the building, you buy this equipment, so it's pretty capital intensive. And you start brewing, and how do you actually get it out to markets? It's, you got in a little bit earlier than a lot of people, but it's a market that there's a lot of people in. And how do you start promoting, first of all, making brew, and then second of all, how do you start promoting your brew, Mike?
Sure. Well, our whole idea was I had just gotten off the Visit Cook County board. So this is just, one of the parts of this business is I want to start a business now that I think I know something, rather than start a business when I know nothing and learn it all the way along. And we had done a study for tourism in Cook County, which is the county we're in, which is the Grand Marais, but Gunflint Trail, it's the Cook County area. And we had done a bunch of studies, and 66% of the visitors to Cook County were from the metro, Minneapolis, St. Paul metro area. 86% of the economy in Cook County was tourism related. And that was if you took government jobs that had something to do with tourists, the game warden, people in the Forest Service that are dealing with people that are going to the boundary woods. But 86% of the economy was related to tourism. And 66% of those people were coming up from the Twin Cities. So our whole idea was, we're going to build a brewery. We got to have good beer. We have to have great beer, but we sure have to have good beer. Corona's good because you're drinking it on the beach in Mexico. Corona maybe isn't so good when you're drinking it, in the middle of the winter and it's dark outside. I mean, I'm just saying, some of it is, right, the experience. And we needed to have good beer. We wanted great beer. It was super important. But we wanted a relationship between the people that came up from the Twin Cities that would come into our tap room, that they would have a beer that was part of their adventure, right? It's going up the Gunflint, it's going skiing at Lutzen, it's renting a vacation rental, looking at Lake Superior and Grand Marais, whatever their thing is in Cook County, because people come for all kinds of different reasons. They're going to drink our beer, they're going to have a relationship with that beer, and then we want them to be able to find it when they get home, in their liquor store or their favorite restaurant. And that was everything we spent our marketing dollars on, was how to do that. And so we went to these liquor stores and restaurants and said, we'll advertise you in our tap room so that when they get back to the cities, they know where we're on. And we didn't have to spend a ton of money. And we spent a fair amount of money on the brand and the logo and the colors and all of that stuff. But the majority of ours is how to tell people to find us in the cities. And Duluth is a good market for us too. And we do that as well there. But Minneapolis Duluth is pretty cool. They don't need Grand Marais, right? I mean, it's pretty cool to live in Duluth. And so if you live in Duluth, it's like, yeah, Grand Marais is not that cool. But if you're in the cities, Grand Marais is pretty dang cool.
Well, I have to disagree with you there,
Okay.
because I live in the Duluth area and I do everything I can to get out and come up your direction, Mike. So that one we'll have to debate
All right,
someday
sounds good.
over a beer.
All right,
How's
beautiful.
that? I'll buy the beer. So where are you now in the business? You started the business in what year?
Well, 2014.
Okay. And where are you now? Obviously, in both businesses, you went through COVID.
Yep.
But let's talk about how that affected the beer business.
Sure. Super scary, right? When you find out, I remember listening to the governor on the radio, because we got word slightly before that we're going to get closed down and that they're going to give us curbside. Well, I'm sorry, curbside in a tap room is a slow death. At least that's what I thought. And we weren't going there. I mean, we did sell growlers and crawlers and it was good, but the bottom line is the people, I think, if you worked hard and you tried to be a fighter about it and figure it out, and I mean, I applied for 1 million grants and the PPP money and all of that, and that stuff was super valuable. It was super valuable, and I was all in. I mean, I was all in that we don't know what's going on. We don't know how to fight this. We don't know how serious it is. We don't know if we have no hospital beds. I never said we shouldn't be doing this, and we went all in. And then when it was time to open, I was all in. We need to open. We need to get back, and that's just been our thing. And we want to do that safely, and we want to do it safely for our employees. But we weathered it pretty dang well, and partly it's because there's some restaurants that decided not to reopen, There were some that were probably already fragile, that this was the linchpin. And we just figured out how to stay open and to work around the rules and how are we going to do mass? How do we set up a wait list? We were a bar. You just came up to the bar and got your own beer. How are we going to do table service? We don't know how to do table service. We've never done table service. And one of the things is, I think when there's adversity, if you don't learn something from it, we've changed the way we do business. We're doing some of it like we did before, and then we're doing some of it different because we found a better, more efficient way to do it. And so, yeah, and the same way at Voyageur Canoe Outfitters, same exact thing, very difficult. But what are we doing? We're putting people into the woods. I mean, we were maxed out. You couldn't, right? You're not going to get on an airplane. You couldn't for a while. You're not going to go to Europe. You're not going to go on a cruise. So we had this slew of people that had never been in the Boundary Waters, or their typical go to Canada with a boat and motor trip, and now they're looking for something else because they can't cross the border. So we were maxed out. So we had record years. Although we had fire and we had different things that kind of brought it back to reality. It could have been really good. So we've survived both of those pretty well. And yeah, still trying to figure out. I mean, the Boundary Waters, they cut permits on Sag and Seagull because it was so used the last 2 years, and I can't get into the Quetico or the Crown Land. So this is a scary year going into Voyageur Canoe Outfitters because we're hoping that we can put enough people on the water to kind of to maintain what we do. And the brewery, I mean, we had a whole bunch of people that had never been in our door before COVID, but because so many other places either just decided not to open or they closed or whatever, people tried us out, and now we're on the checklist, right? You go to Grand Marais, you go to World's Famous Donuts, and you go to Java Moose, and you get your beer, and so now we're part of the itinerary for a lot of people when they come through or to Grand Marais. And so, I'm feeling pretty good.
Mike, how do you balance your time now? Because your two businesses are 65 miles apart. Yep. And how do you balance your time between the two businesses?
One time I watched a Johnny Carson show. Probably now I am showing that we've known each other for 30 years. And it was a woman, and she was, I don't know, 80, 90, maybe 100 years old, and she had 12 kids. And Johnny Carson says, "Which one do you love most? Which of your children do you love most?" And her answer was, "Whichever one needs it that day the most." And I thought that was a really good answer because Johnny Carson thought he had her. But I've got really, really good staff and managers in both places. We spend more time at the brewery. It's a newer business. It's the child that needs us the most at the moment. We get, and it's less seasonal than the brewery or the outfitter. The outfitter in the summer, we try to get up there 1 or 2 nights a week. My wife still does the marketing. I still am the CFO. I mean, I do the we're doing the marketing and the finance and stuff, and we can do that from wherever. And then I got a young couple that is day-to-day operations. So we're on the phone all the time. When something doesn't work, I get in the car and I drive up there. And then, we are able to get up there 1 or 2 nights a week. So spending more time at the brewery just because of the stage that the business is at and the fact that it's year round.
I got to tell you, the couple that you have up at the resort, Matt and Cass, are awesome, and they make people feel so welcome, and they are so knowledgeable to make people feel safe. So that's really good, and what a great choice. And you surrounded yourself.
Well, and they have some new news. They are expecting. So they're going to be the next generation of raising. It's the best place in the world to raise a kid, by the way, at the end of the Gunflint Trail. And they found out that it's twins. So they are going to have an interesting fall. They got 2 baby girls coming this fall. And my wife is super excited.
I hope that this podcast isn't letting the cat out of the bag.
Well, it might, but I will go for it. I think it's pretty great. News. So yes, so it'll be a whole nother generation of kids on that longest school bus route.
That is so great. So we're running short on time here, but we want to go personal on you now, Mike. We want to find out a few of your favorite things in the world. So this we call our packed questions segment, Mike. And folks, this is Mike Prom, the owner of Voyageurs Canoe Outfitters and Voyageur Brewing Company, Grand Marais, and the end of the Gunflint Trail. So, Mike Prom, what's your favorite vacation destination? And I think I know this one.
Well, I have two. So if it's in the summer, it's absolutely canoe country. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area / Quetico Provincial Park is by far my favorite place on earth, hands down, in the summer. In the winter, it would be St. John's, Virgin Islands. I haven't been there for a few years, but it is pretty awesome.
What is your favorite movie?
Probably Miracle on Ice. I'm of the right age where, I remember, I think it was my dad that before that happened said, well, it's unfair. It's kind of like the Gopher football team playing the Vikings, right? And then that happened. And I just remember, I was probably middle school-ish, 10, 12 years old. And that was a big deal. So I love that movie. Shown it a bunch of times, and then probably Talladega Nights is my second. So now you know a little bit about me. So go from a serious good movie to just a really dorky one.
Perfect. I skipped actually school to go listen to the U.S. against the Russians that day and listened on an old transistor radio with a 9-volt battery in it.
Oh yeah, that was something. And then Herb Brooks ended up at St. Cloud State. That was the guy that took him to Division I. So you got to love that.
You know what? And the arena in St. Cloud is
awesome.
Named after Herb Brooks.
Yep,
it's a Herb Brooks National Arena. And what's your biggest fear, Mike?
My biggest fear, I'm a guy, I'm worried a little bit about a few things, but I think my biggest fear is that wilderness becomes kind of a religion that can't be used. I don't know if you know what I mean by that, but I think I love nature. I love the Quetico. I love and sometimes it's easier to say, it'd be easier just to not let people in it. And then it makes me nervous. And kind of the next, when I talk with Matt and Cass, and there's a problem right now. People are using the wilderness differently, and COVID really showed it. I mean, I'm bummed that we have permits that are cut, and I think there was maybe some different solutions, or there might be some different solutions to that. But we had a whole bunch of people that used it. And when I started 30 years ago, people went on 7-day canoe trips, and they did 17, 18, 19 portages with crap that was way heavier than it is now. I mean, it was harder. I mean, the canoes were heavier, the gear was heavier, food was heavier. And now people back up with their coolers and all of their cool gear. And I got cool gear. You got cool gear. I love cool gear, right? I love it. And then they paddle an hour and set up a base camp on the first lake. And then they're bummed if they see somebody. And they go for a 3-day trip because that's all the time they have. And I'm not dissing 3-day trips. I take lots of 3-day trips now because that's the time that I have. But my fear is that we don't solve this problem to keep these places and keep these places accessible, or we just close them down because it's easier. Because we don't want to deal with the safety issue of fire. We don't want to deal with how are we going to open more campsites, or how are we going to do this, or how are we going to do that. So my fear is that this is something that's kind of lost.
Oh, I hope not. And I hope Matt and Cass are a tribute to that, because they'll get that next generation going here.
Absolutely.
To those places. And by the time this airs, I will be a grandpa for the first time. And I promise everybody that I will not allow on my family that love of the outdoors and conservation and literally seeing the northern lights or listening to a wolf howl in the winter in those places. My grandchildren will see that as long as I'm able to. And Mike, what is the best piece of life advice you personally ever received?
I think I've gotten the same kind of advice a couple, 3 times a different way. And it has to do with not making decisions based on when you're emotional, or, so that old cliche, right? Sleep on it. I believe that. I mean, if I have a tough decision and I have the ability to I always say noodle on it overnight, I usually am a way better place the next day to make a good decision. To go along with that, one of my mentors would always say, is that fear or fact? Is that emotion or fact? Collect the data, because we make so many choices based on our emotions rather than the facts. And so time sometimes heals that, but collecting data. So I guess that would be that's one that I've used a lot. I find myself, I'm a really passionate, emotional person. So I have to, that's one of my, that's an advantage and a disadvantage. And so I have to force myself sometimes to just take a deep breath and get the yellow tablet out, and pros and cons, write it down, sleep on it. I pray on it. And then the next day, just being able to say, hey, I feel really good about this decision, or it's the best decision I can make, but I know that I didn't take it lightly. I didn't just make a rash decision.
Mike, we want to thank you so much. This information from a true entrepreneur, that a guy who has 2 successful businesses. We really appreciate your time today and taking that with us and teaching us a lot, because you certainly have.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for having me.
And we look forward to doing good things with you in the future and keeping our friendship going. Folks, this has been Mike Prom. He's the owner of both Voyageur Canoe Outfitters and Voyageur Brewing Company. And I implore you to take a trip to Grand Marais and then up the Gunflint Trail and be a patron of Mike, because you will learn what customer service is about. He knows how to run his businesses and is a great human being. Mike, thank you so much. And folks, until next time, unplug from the indoors and recharge in the outdoors.